In a world of endless information, some stories demand a closer look. The details that matter, the connections that count. From tech to politics, aviation to space travel, science to medicine, health and safety. Welcome to the YoJoeShow Podcast in Focus.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the YoJoeShow Podcast. Hey, Joe, how you doing?
Hey, yo, heart's beating, lungs are working. How you doing?
I'm awake and alive and excited for this In Focus episode. What about you?
Absolutely. In focus number 6, and this one's one that we've been working on for quite some time with a lot of developments that have occurred over the past couple of weeks. I'm glad we finally decided to sit down and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, exciting developments. We've been waiting just about 2 years to hear, so hopefully along with all our
Absolutely.
viewers.
Yeah, and as we've been discussing on a lot of our regular episodes, this is obviously related to what happened on October 7th, my birthday, 2023. And hostages were the ones that were actually taken, if not just slaughtered, were held for, I believe it's 738 days, many of which now we're hearing in atrocious conditions. And it varied from one to the other. Some might have had better accommodations, let's say. There was one that I think today we were hearing was kept in a cage essentially the entire time.
Yeah,
Just like unbelievable. And that these people survived in the conditions that they were in for this long a time is remarkable in and of itself. And no one should ever have to go through what they went through. It was unprecedented. It was indeed the worst event since the Holocaust, that people just came in and were just slaughtered and were dragged off into Gaza to be kept as pawns for political and who knows what.
to ensure Hamas's survival, I think that's the main reason why they take these hostages, is because they understand the value that Jews have always placed on releasing hostages. It's one of the core or good deeds that a Jew can do is to donate in order to release hostages, because throughout Jewish history, Jews were always a minority that were chased upon, and it was always pretty valuable to just kidnap a few and then demand a ransom. So unfortunately, Jews have been accustomed to this almost for about 2 millennia. But this, like you mentioned, has been more brutal than most. Many times they were in caves they couldn't stand up in, or recently I just heard that there were 7 together in a pit where they couldn't sit down, or they just had to stand for basically days and days straight. Just horrific conditions, like you were mentioning.
Yeah, and to put things in perspective for the rest of the viewers, life in Israel, which firsthand, is different. To have a bomb shelter in the United States is a World War II era thing that typically you don't see people installing bomb shelters these days. But what about in Israel?
Yeah, every new apartment or home comes with basically a room that's a bomb shelter room, and it's like a proper bomb shelter, and it does save lives. Older buildings will usually have in the basement a bomb shelter for the whole building, and then it's less convenient if you don't have enough time, or if your building doesn't have one of those. Some neighborhoods will have them scattered around, and but everybody's trained on where to go if the alarm goes off or if there's a red alert, which is the term for rockets being shot. Because what people may not realize is that Hamas has been shooting thousands or tens of thousands of rockets at Israel over the past 20 years, right? This isn't just like a new occurrence. It's not peaceful neighbors that just decided one day to come up and massacre. This has really been going on and on. That's obviously in addition to what we've been seeing recently with the missiles from the Houthis and from Iran and the drones, the ICBMs, and everything else in between.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I remember as a child, my mom recounting that when she was a child, she was taught in school that if you hear the air raid sirens, and this was in Portugal, different times and different players, but they were taught as children that if you heard the air raid siren, you would have to go and you'd hide under your desk. Not that the desk would entirely protect you, but it was the best thing you could do if you're in a classroom somewhere. They wanted the kids to stop playing or running around or doing whatever, and they would be under their desks in case maybe parts of the ceiling would come in, fall
Mhm.
down on their heads. So it's just that most of us have grown up now, certainly in the West, in the United States, definitely Canada, much of Western civilization, we take for granted our safety. We don't live as in Israel, for example, where there's these looming threats that have always existed. And in 2023, on October 6th, essentially things were as they would normally be. And there was peace basically, and there really wasn't any heightened threat alert or anything like that. And out of nowhere, the neighbors in from Gaza came across and literally just killed people, ripped babies from the wombs of live mothers who are pregnant watching this, burned babies, did just things you can't even imagine. So much so that there are people like, oh, that was all made up. Just like there are people say the
Yeah.
Holocaust isn't real. No, it's all real. It's hard to conceive that anybody would actually do these kinds of things, but they did. And again, as we look to the journey over the last couple of years now, there's been a lot of Hamas has done, which is a terrorist group that essentially controls the area in Gaza and the people of quote unquote Palestine. The reality is they've done a very good job with PR. We've had college campuses here in the United States supporting the Palestinians and freeing Palestine and acting as if they're being oppressed and talking about how Israel is causing genocide on the people, trying to wipe out the people there, when really do we not know what happened on October 7th? Do we not know that everything
Well,
was
the genocide is one-sided because genocide requires intention, and there's very clear evidence that one side tries to commit genocide, but they don't have the means to do it, versus one side who does have the means and can do it within 48 hours, but takes every precaution to avoid doing so.
No, listen, war is not something anybody should want on anybody. And obviously, this really, I think, has brought a focus to the generations that are alive now and the younger generations who are looking at this, trying to understand the atrocities and the realities of war and kind of what all this means. It's not a video game. These are real lives. These are people being destroyed, essentially, and including the people that live in Gaza. That is true, but they're the recipients of what was caused by the leaders who decided there to go and slaughter people in Israel. And it is
The leaders,
everything consequences.
it's also worth noting that those are the leaders that they voted wholeheartedly in the one democratic election they ever had, and are, until at least the war began, were extremely supportive of. So it's worth noting that the vast majority of people in Gaza, as in 95+%, gleefully supported and celebrated the massacre. And this is the difference between, let's say, the Holocaust, October 7th, is that during the Holocaust, German soldiers were really struggling. Like, you can read it in their memoirs, with the mass murder of innocent people. And it was something that was really hard on them. They would take a lot of drugs, were given a lot of alcohol, a lot of them committed suicide. And the Nazis tried to erase the evidence of their atrocities because they were aware of how bad these atrocities are. Whereas Hamas literally were GoPros and live streamed the whole thing. And in many situations, they actually took the people who they were massacring's phones and went out to Facebook and started a live stream and showed their friends and family, these 70-year-old ladies, Holocaust survivors, children, who knows what else, literally just live streaming on Facebook the massacre of your friends and family. So, yeah, it's obviously very devastating, but it's also worth noting that there were three waves on October 7th. The first wave was Hamas's kind of Nukhba, which is like special forces. The second wave was like the rest of Hamas forces, or a lot of other Hamas forces, not the main brigades, but just a lot of other Hamas forces. But the third wave were just Gazans who just went in to have fun, enjoy the massacre, find some Jewish girls they can rape. It's also important and worth noting that almost every single person who entered Israel is someone who has never met an Israeli before in their life, has never spoken to an Israeli before in their life. Most of these terrorists were fairly young, and they grew up never having any meaningful relationship with an Israeli or a Jew, but they were brought up through the education system funded by the UN, through UNRWA and other organizations that we funded with our tax money. They were brought up and indoctrinated, because these UNRWA schools were actually run by Hamas, to hate Jews beyond any kind of, I want to say reasonable measure, but there shouldn't be any reason to hate anybody. But it's just like a vitriol and hatred. Unfortunately, this is something that is ingrained in Islam, in many teachings of Islam. Obviously, there are modern Muslims who have that away and have taken a much more open view of Islam and much more moderate. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Muslims around the world saw October 7th and celebrated. There are hadiths in Islam that basically say that their quote unquote Messiah, or the final day, cannot come until all Jews are massacred. So it's unfortunately something that's very deep in the religion, but also in the culture and traditions, and of course the brainwashing of the people in Gaza. And even now, the vast majority of Palestinians still support October 7th, still support Hamas. Hamas is extremely popular in the West Bank, even though Fatah, which is another former terror organization that basically decided to commit jihad through politics, has been in control with the Palestinian Authority. The reason why there haven't been any elections is because Abu Mazen, the leader there, is very much aware that if there are elections, Hamas is going to win and then massacre him, just like they did in Gaza. So yeah, it's very problematic having neighbors like that.
Yeah, and I think it's more complicated than meets the eye. When you just see a news story and you're living here in the United States, it's very hard to understand all the nuances of what really is going on. If, in fact, some of the reporters are reporting on things that they may not completely understand. Maybe for our viewers to help put things in context, you're not just talking out of turn, so to speak. You spend quite a bit of time in Israel. If you want to talk.
Yeah, I have experience running into air raid shelters and bomb shelters and running away from rockets and missiles myself. I served in the IDF doing military intelligence during a previous round of escalation, quote unquote, or a war with Hamas. So I got the chance to experience things firsthand, unfortunately. It's not something that any Israeli wants. Israel dreams of having neighbors like Sweden or Switzerland or Canada. But unfortunately, in the Middle East, it is the Middle East, and many people there have the mindset of 7th century. And basically, the only language they understand is the language of force and power. And this is something that we've seen repeatedly a lot of European nations and leaders be blind to. Is sometimes they feel that if they can feed the beast, maybe the beast won't eat them, in a very Chamberlain-esque style of appeasement, saying, hey, if we recognize a Palestinian state, our local Muslims won't try and riot as much. Maybe if we don't prosecute them for grooming gangs, then they won't try and overthrow us or they'll vote for us. But Israel unfortunately tried that as well. For many years, the left in Israel were in control, or even when the right was in control, that mindset, the Oslo mindset of peace through land, right? Maybe if we give them land, then they'll give us peace. Unfortunately, that mindset was in control, including in 2005, when I was able to get smuggled into the last Jewish communities or quote unquote settlements in Gaza before they were destroyed by Israel. And they were forcefully evacuated. And then they weren't exactly destroyed by Israel, but they were at least forcefully evacuated by Israel, because there was this notion that maybe if we give Gaza its own autonomy, its own land, it had an airport at the time, it had a port, it'll become Singapore of the Middle East, right? That was the hope. Jews have been dreaming of having a nice hummus in Gaza for a very long time. It's also worth noting that there has been a Jewish community in Gaza for thousands of years, until probably 75 years ago or so. And there's been this idea through the Oslo Accords later that maybe if all we can do is appease the beast, it'll stop trying to chew us to pieces. But I think what October 7th really taught every single Israeli and most sane people around the world is that appeasement in this matter really doesn't work. It gives your enemies the sense that they're victorious, and it only whettens their appetite even further.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as we look at the peace deal and we look at how things are unfolding. In fact, probably the best thing to do is to take a little bit of a step back, because we started preparing for this In Focus episode. Really, this was before the peace deal. This was when all this was being discussed and negotiated. And the first things that kept coming out, and we kept mentioning on some of the episodes of our regular podcast series, were countries that were coming forward like Australia and Canada and essentially saying, we recognize Palestine as an independent state. And essentially that they were saying, yes, we believe that there should be a two-state solution. There should be the state of Israel and there should be the state of Palestine. And there's a whole lot of nuance as to whether or not there's ever really been a state of Palestine, and really whether or not that is the right way to go, and whether or not that is rewarding Hamas, a terrorist organization, and allowing them to be recognized in some bigger, broader way. But regardless, that was in the early parts of our preparing for this episode. So let's start with a video compilation that talks a little bit about that and brings some insight into the quote-unquote two-state solution. I think we could start with that, and as we start moving forward, there'll be other video compilations we can play to discuss. That seem fair?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right, here we go.
As I was leaving Heathrow Airport, this friendly-looking old English guy put his finger in my face and said that I was rude to the Prime Minister. Is it rude to ask why he was so uncomfortable making this announcement next to an American president?
Not even remotely. It's exactly the right question. The President of the United States has had absolute moral clarity on this issue. Keir Starmer, Mark Carney, Albanese in Australia have anything but. And you can hear from Keir Starmer there exactly why. Because there is no way to, quote unquote, recognize a state of Palestine, a country that has no borders, no government, and apparently no responsibility for the health and well-being of its own citizens, without actually rewarding Hamas, which is currently holding at least 40 hostages, possibly 20 of them alive, and could end the war at any minute simply by surrendering those hostages. So they're handing a giant reward to terrorists in the middle of a war that Israel is fighting against a terror group that Starmer himself says has to be extirpated.
Also, what they're saying is they recognize Palestine in the 67 borders, meaning West Bank and Gaza, and they would live in peace. You have to have a peace agreement with Israel. Would you accept that? That's the...
No, I would.
Why?
Because I don't want to live in peace with Palestine, with Israel. I mean, I want to live in peace alone, like as Palestine.
Well, you'd be Palestine. You'd just be next to Israel, like you're next to Jordan.
No, that's not the same thing. Like, we're Palestine. There's no Israel.
In Palestine in the 67 borders, that Israel and Palestine will live together in peace.
Personal point of view, this is not correct. This is not right. Palestine should not be divided.
Well, what happens if it is?
Should we see it as a just that? Should we see it as a just that? Of course I wouldn't, and no Palestinian would. And for whatever, and for what will happen later, there will be resistance.
But understand, when the Europeans say they recognize Palestine, they recognize only Palestine in 67 and borders, only Gaza and West Bank, and that you have to make peace with Israel.
وهي الأرض كلها من البحر للنهر لفلسطين يعني وهذا الاتحاد أصلا ما في قانون دولي يعني أنت لو بتحكي عن قانون دولي أنت روح شوف الأطفال اللي بالنهر.
And all of this is Palestine from the river to the sea.
In Europe, European countries are recognizing Palestine. What do you think?
I would like Palestine to be recognized as the whole of Palestine, 27.7 thousand kilometers.
Meaning historic Palestine, what's today Israel.
I hope that they recognize all of it. The recognition be a real one and not so that they can do something under the table like sell weapons to Israel.
When they say they recognize Palestine, they mean Palestine in the 67 borders, living next to Israel in peace.
I'm against it. I'm against it.
So why?
Because Palestine is ours. It's full of checkpoints, full of settlements.
But it wouldn't be if there was a peace agreement.
Planet Earth should recognize Palestine. Palestine is the heart of the world.
فلسطين تاريخيا
Historic Palestine. Historic Palestine.
Meaning no Israel.
يعني ما يكون في إسرائيل. هذا شيء يعني تاريخيا. The natural right for the Palestinians. Israel is people who came from all over Europe and Russia. They don't have any origins here, any roots here. The Samaritans are the original Jews in Palestine, and they do not recognize the Zionists.
From the river to the sea, as people chanted in the colleges in the United States. Maybe you can put in perspective a little bit of the history without going into too long with this, but essentially helping make sure we're putting the proper framework for the discussion and why the people being interviewed who clearly have in their minds one thing, and it all basically means that there can't be room for Israel, that it has no right to exist. As you could see, they're saying that very matter-of-factly. It's not even that they were being mean about it. They were just saying there is no such thing as Israel. They need to leave.
Yeah, that's a great point. First of all, credit to the Ask Project. I think his name is Corey. He's been doing kind of phenomenal work like this for many years. Definitely worth giving him a follow. I think to understand the context, it's worth understanding the name. The name Palestine was given to the land where Israel is when the Romans conquered it from the Jews, from specifically the Judean kingdom. The Israelite kingdom, which was another Jewish kingdom, was defeated by the Babylonians earlier. But the reason that the Romans chose this name for this land is because historically and in the Bible, the Jews had an historic enemy named the Philistines. So to remind them of this land, they called the Jewish land Palestine. Now, the Philistines were not what we would call Palestinians. Obviously, all of these stories in the Bible occurred before Islam was created, before Muhammad was ever born, and before the Arabs ever left Arabia en masse. So it has nothing to do with what nowadays we consider Palestinians. They were actually a group of Phoenician sea people who came and created ancient Philistine. So they have nothing to do with what we consider nowadays Palestinians. But the name was given by the Romans to the Jewish land, right? It was a term for the Jewish land. The name resurfaced. It wasn't in existence under the various empires that then controlled the land ever since, including when the Muslims came out of Arabia and conquered the entire Middle East and North Africa and into Europe. People don't realize, but Islam conquered most of Spain, half of France, Vienna, Austria. They almost conquered more than once. So and then obviously the Byzantine Empire was in control of the land for a very long time, and the Ottomans were in control. It didn't have any name during any of this periods, and there was no specific group that lived there that ruled that area. It was just a territory within the Ottoman Empire until the name resurfaced when the British decided to, after World War I, the French and with Sykes-Picot, the French and the British kind of divvied up pretty randomly the Middle East. And the British kind of received that. The French received kind of Lebanon and Syria. And Britain decided to rename it in its ancient name, Palestine. Now, that name was given specifically to a lot of the Jews that were there. So traditionally, when the British were referring to it, when they were referred to Palestinians, it was the Jewish people who were living in Palestine. And they would just call the Arabs Arabs, because the Arabs were not a single nationality or anything to do with necessarily historic Palestine. So that's the first thing.
So we're doing the geography of Israel being placed within what they're saying is historical Palestine. They're arguing that Palestine encompassed from the river to the sea. And maybe talk a little bit about just that context. So in the minds of a lot of people living in the Gaza Strip, they've been convinced and they've been taught that really that is their land, and Israel encroached and showed up out of nowhere. If you notice, the one man who mentions those are Sumerians, they're not the original Jews anyways. And we've talked a little bit about this in prior episodes of our podcast, where that just isn't true. There is truth that many European Jews came back, but it doesn't mean that there hasn't been any continuous presence. Maybe you want to speak to that point.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Throughout all of history, there has been continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel, specifically in cities like Hebron, Tzfat, Jerusalem, Haifa, Jaffa, and others throughout all of history. So there's always small Jewish communities in the land. The Jews never left because it's so important to Judaism. People don't realize that the Jewish religion is basically based around the land of Israel. It's about the holiness of the land. It's about temples that can only be in the land and later could have only been in the city of Jerusalem. Anytime Jews pray, they're mentioning dozens of times in every prayer, Jerusalem or Israel, and they're facing, every time they pray, they're facing Jerusalem, whereas the Muslims face Mecca, right? So when they're in Jerusalem, they literally point their asses towards Jerusalem and they face Mecca. Yeah, the river is the Jordan River, and then the sea obviously is the Mediterranean Sea. Gaza historically is like a small enclave that was controlled by Egypt for a lot of the time. And then what is now Judea and Samaria, or colloquially known as the West Bank, is called the West Bank because it was the West Bank of the Jordan River. Why did it receive that name? Is because in 1948, the Jordanian military was able to conquer that land when the British left, and it was the West Bank of Jordan. So it was like the extra property of Jordan that they didn't really want, they conquered. So even then, not Egypt, not Jordan, gave the Palestinians a state because they didn't recognize the Palestinians as a people, because the Palestinians were not a people. If you want to trace the history of the Palestinian people, you can look into Palestinian names. The vast majority of their names come from or resemble where they came from. Al-Misri came from Egypt, and different names from different parts from where they came from different parts of Syria, etc. And a lot of what we nowadays consider Palestinians are unfortunately, Jews that were forced to convert to Islam over centuries by sword, and then B, as kind of Zionism started to bring Jews back to the land of Israel, there became a lot of financial opportunities. So there were a lot of migrants that came into work, and it's really this mixture of people from all over. So have there been Arabs that lived in the land throughout a very long time? Of course. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of what we now consider Palestinians were not born in Palestine or Israel and have never been there because they are essentially quote unquote refugees from 1948. But like we discussed in previous episodes, no other refugee has ever received the special status where their children and grandchildren and great grandchildren are considered refugees. It's usually just something you receive for 2 or 3 years until you're settled, and then you're no longer a refugee. But because the Arab countries always had this dream of demolishing Israel and pushing the Jews into the sea, as they literally said, they always promised the quote unquote Palestinian Arabs, hey, don't worry, stay refugees because we're going to kill the Jews and we're going to give you their homes. So you'll be able to come back. So that kind of a little bit explains, I guess, the rationale of that area. And it's also worth noting that the piece of land is really minuscule. It's tiny. It literally takes 20 minutes to drive from one side to the next, at least let's say in the narrow parts of Tel Aviv, to drive to Judea and Samaria. And it's just really short. It's about the size of New Jersey. It's a tiny little place, and it's surrounded by 22 Arab countries, by 52 Muslim majority countries. It's not like Arabs or Muslims have a lack of where to go. It's not like other Muslim or Arab refugees have nowhere else to go. We just saw literally in this past year, Pakistan forcefully evicting or doing a Nakba catastrophe, which is what the nickname that the Palestinians received, to 2 million Afghanis. And this is happening all the time throughout the entire Arab world. Nobody gives a crap. Nobody cares, because if there's no Jews, there's no news, there's nobody to blame. Why make a fuss about it? Should we discuss the idea that the Jews are not really the Jews?
We can. And then I think I have something else I want to bring up. But go ahead. Let's do that next, because I think that's important.
Yeah, obviously, Jews it's a tribe. Most Jews are related to each other, shares pretty similar DNA. So you can take a DNA test and see what percent Jewish you are. And Jewish DNA is actually similar to, it is Middle Eastern DNA. So it is DNA from the Levant, from this area. It's not European DNA, let's just say. But a lot of Muslims kind of struggle with the idea because Muhammad himself gave credit, because Islam recognizes the prophets of Christianity and Judaism, that Jews have a right to the land of Israel. So it's like an oxymoron in their head. So they figured out a cool idea. There was an empire in the kind of Stans area, more or less where the Ukraine, but there was a land called Khuzari, and it was in between the Byzantine Empire and the Mamluk kingdoms, and they wanted to trade with both, and the leaders decided to convert to Judaism. This was about 750 current era, so a very long time ago. They lasted for about 200 years until the Mongols and mostly the Kievan Rus, so what ended up becoming the Russians, conquered and destroyed them. The Muslims will claim that all European Jews, even though there's direct history of their travels throughout history and how they ended up in Europe, and they have a genealogy and histories and names literally dating back to King David, a lot of Jews are able to name all their forefathers back to ancient Jews who lived in Israel. But they'll claim that all of that is fake and that all European Jews are really not Jews. They're these descendants of these Khuzaris that ran away to Europe. So they're not even the real Jews. They're not the Banu Israel, the children of Israel that Muhammad is referring to. And therefore, they have no legitimacy. The reason that argument is extra stupid, aside from the fact that it has no base in reality, because the vast majority of the Khuzari Jews were just destroyed and annihilated, is that when you go to Israel, you notice that the vast majority of Israelis do not look like Europeans. Most Israelis are of Middle Eastern descent. So most Israelis come from Morocco is the largest cohort, but all over the Middle East. A lot of Israelis have their ancestry from various places of the Middle East that they were evicted from by force, talk about a Nakba or disaster, in 1948, or beforehand or afterwards. The minute there was a Jewish state, everybody was, get out of here. It's funny, Jews were always blamed for not having a state. Why don't you go back to your land? Get back to your home. What are you doing here? Why are you in Europe? Why are you here? How did you get here? Go back, get away. And then finally they had somewhere to go. They were literally kicked out and forced to go there. And then suddenly it's, oh, how dare you take somebody else's land? It's like, where should we go? To the ocean is where they really want us to go, right? So yeah, I think that's very important. And then in this video we watched, they discussed the two-state solution. And the Kurds are a huge ethnic group that lives in modern day Iran and Turkey and Syria. And they want a state with every fiber of their being, right? They fought ISIS to get a state. They've been fighting the Turks to get a state. The Turks literally massacre them. But they never once had the opportunity to get a state. And anytime they did, like now there's talk of Rojava becoming a state, part of Syria. There's just like, yes, give us a state because they want a state. The Palestinians have been offered a state over 8 times. And every single time they say no, because it's not that they want a state. What they really want is the Jews not to have a state. They want to get rid of the Jewish state. So that's, I think, something that's really important. One of the ladies there actually said, I don't want to live in peace with Israel. Like straight up, blunt, right to your face. It's funny because...
And she wasn't being mean about it. It was a very matter of fact, just that's the way it is. And that a lot of people there, they think that's perfectly normal to think that way. Right? It's just,
exactly.
It's not like they're making some incredible statement. This is just a normal thing. They're being asked what they feel is a dumb question. What do you mean? Israel's not supposed to be there. We need to get rid of Israel. And I think that's the part that here, like certainly in the United States, people are missing that point. And when you hear, and that was the topic that I was going to bring up, was the next thing, which you're bringing up now, is this the opposition to this two-state solution from our perspective here is because essentially people are saying, you don't get it. Them asking for a two-state solution is recognize Palestine as an independent state and all this, and that Israel has no claim to it and can't have IDF forces there, no military forces, can't do any protection, can't do anything. But they really don't want that, because if you hear people on the ground speaking, their thought is, yeah, you have to recognize us and then vacate. And they're like, Israel could be somewhere, but it can't be here. It's like the bar's closed. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So the mentality is, if Israel's going to have a state, they don't want it there. That's a really important thing that kind of gets missed in the discussion when people say two-state solution. Okay, you have the neighbors who don't want Israel to be there at all, period. End of story. That's a problem. Yes. And the next video we're going to put up, the compilation, really segues into discussing the peace deal. Because again, that's one of the things. And Trump said, for example, he said if the folks of Hamas and the people in the Palestinian area in Gaza stopped focusing all of their money, all of the resources, all the humanitarian aid that goes there, gets converted into ways of actually destroying Israel. That's where all the energy is. That's where all the focus is. If you see how much money, effort, and resources have been pumped into the region over the decades, the reality is they have nothing to show for it. They really don't have what you would expect to happen and what Israel wanted to happen when they ceded all that land. As you said, the idea was, listen, we're okay with this. If they just want to be our peaceful neighbors who aren't making too much noise and blowing us up every other day, okay, fine. We'll be okay with it. It's almost like a dispute when someone says, your fence is in my property here. You got to move the fence. You got to give me an extra few feet of land and we'll stop complaining. And Israel finally said, okay, fine, take it. We'll move our fence over. We'll do whatever we have to do. We'll uproot tons of people from their homes who this was their homes. Israel removed actual people living there and said, you have to leave because we're ceding all this land now to these folks that are going to have some semi-state of their own, and you happen to live in it, and you're Jewish and you can't live there, or you're Israeli and you can't live there. They did all of this, and in the end, it came and bit them in the rear end. So that's why I think people don't get, oh yeah, two-state solution. And they don't understand why people are like, no, that's a horrible thing because it hasn't worked. You can't just keep this, because they want to like keep moving the goalposts and changing where the fence is to the, like you said, until one fence is on the river, one fence is on the sea, and there's nothing left in between, and the neighbor of Israel is completely eradicated. And that's the part of the conversation, the unspoken words, although on the streets you can see they are admitting it, but that's a thing that here in the United States, a lot of on college campuses, kids don't get. That's the issue. It's not that people don't want to allow the neighbors in Gaza to have a home and live and have their work and do whatever and thrive even. It's that every time they let them do that, they're building a way to destroy Israel. And that's the issue, which, by the way, as we've mentioned in numerous other episodes, how many non-Jews are there in Israel? A lot. Muslims, Christians, you name it.
There are over 2 million Muslims and close to 1 million, a lot of Russians and stuff like that, who a big part of them are Christians, let's just say.
Which again negates this whole genocide thing. If you were trying to eradicate a people and you have 2 million living as your neighbor, in Israel, don't you think they would have started? If
My
Israel
landlord was an Arab Muslim, you know what I mean?
It's idiotic. It doesn't even hold. But most people that are saying that, is Benjamin Netanyahu is causing genocide onto the people. No, there are people that are victims of an ongoing battle, of the war that was going on. Yes. But, and as you pointed out, extreme measures were taken. In fact, Israel is the only country that ever supplied aid to the people that they're actually fighting against, and they're supplying aid to them and allowing aid to go in. Okay, that's like unheard of, and yet it's still not good enough. Okay, and ultimately they're being accused of genocide when they have, wait a minute, if they're trying to murder all these people, they're there living amongst them as police, serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, as judges, as teachers, as professors, it's just that the average person that's hearing that, certainly in the United States, doesn't get that. So the argument falls apart the minute you understand the details. I think we should segue soon to looking at the peace deal a little bit and being able to start talking a little more about what's transpired.
Yeah, 100%. The epitome of what you mentioned is there was a Muslim Arab Supreme Court judge named Salim Jubran, and he put an Israeli prime minister in jail for corruption, and he put an Israeli president in jail for sexually assaulting an assistant of his, right? So it's like the epitome of not racism or any form of discrimination. You can't imagine that in apartheid South Africa, Israel is obviously regularly compared to apartheid South Africa, there would be no situation where a black judge sends the white prime minister to jail. Like, it's just inconceivable. Blacks sat in the back of the bus or didn't get on the bus at all. You know what I mean? It was
the ruling of the judge would have been vacated in some manner by the Supreme Court or whatever, and said, no, that's not happening. And
there wouldn't be a judge, a black judge.
Of course, there wouldn't even be a judge. Of course. Listen, we got a lot of really ridiculous things that happen here in the United States too. We have in a few days, we have the second serving of the No King's Day, which again, ironically, when we covered the first No King's Day, yeah, we do have, that's why we're an independent country. We don't under British rule anymore. And the reality is, if we had a king, the king would not allow us to be able to go and protest and do all the things we do. Just like when we talk about racism here in the United States, which of course there is, the reality is that we had a president that served 2 terms who was black, and clearly it doesn't mean that there is no opportunity for someone because of their race in this country. It doesn't mean that that one person doesn't dislike another because of some other factor, such as race, such as whatever. Those type of disputes and discrimination certainly can happen anywhere, including Israel, but it's not the way it's being portrayed here, certainly on the college campus crowd, with them basically acting as if Israel is going and just trying to eradicate people. It's like the opposite. I think they've been very restrained in what they've done, given what was done upon the people of Israel that were actually in Israel, including American citizens, on October 7, 2023. But let's take a look at the compilation we have, just really segueing into the peace deal, and we could talk a little more specifically about some of the details. Take a look.
Thank you very much, everybody. So this is a big, big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the great days ever in civilization. Things that have been going on for hundreds of years and thousands of years. We're at a minimum very, very close, and I think we're beyond very close. And I want to, they said, have you spoken to the Arab leaders? Have you spoken to all of the other leaders that we have to get? A lot of people involved in this one. I also want to thank Prime Minister Netanyahu for agreeing to the plan and for trusting that if we work together, we can bring an end to the death and destruction that we've seen for so many years, decades, even centuries, and begin a new chapter of security, peace, and prosperity for the entire region. And I want to just say that my meetings and dialogue that we had with so many countries, Saudi Arabia as an example, the king is a phenomenal person. The Emir of Qatar, he's an incredible people.
Your leadership abroad is changing the world for the better, ending wars and advancing peace. I believe that today we're taking a critical step towards both ending the war in Gaza and setting the stage for dramatically advancing peace in the Middle East, and I think beyond the Middle East, in very important Muslim countries. I support your plan to end the war in Gaza, which achieves our war aims. It will bring back to Israel all our hostages, dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, end its political rule, and ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel. We would not have achieved this turning point without the courage and sacrifice of our incredibly brave soldiers. They fight like lions to defend the people of Israel, and they serve on the front line in the war between civilization and barbarism. Mr. President, when our two countries stand shoulder to shoulder, we achieve the impossible. Just a few months ago, in Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer, we struck a decisive blow against Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. Your bold decision to send those B-2s made the region safer and the world safer. Now, under your leadership, we're taking the next step to win the war and expand the peace. Your plan is consistent with the 5 principles my government set for the end of the war and the day after Hamas. Everybody asks, what is your plan for the day after Hamas? Here's our plan. Passed it in the cabinet. All our hostages, both those who are alive and those who died, all of them will return home immediately. Hamas will be disarmed. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will retain security responsibility, including a security perimeter for the foreseeable future. And lastly, Gaza will have a peaceful civilian administration that is run neither by Hamas nor by the Palestinian Authority. If Hamas agrees to your plan, Mr. President, the first step will be a modest withdrawal, followed by the release of all our hostages within 72 hours.
Still a lot of questions there, but the huge headline, Hamas says it will release all of the remaining Israeli hostages, living and dead. That's been a huge sticking point for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ever since the war broke out almost 2 years ago exactly. Hamas also agreeing to, quote, hand over the administration of the Gaza Strip to a Palestinian body of independence based on Palestinian national consensus and Arab and Islamic support. Meanwhile, just within the last hour, President Trump responding to the news with this video.
I want to thank the countries that helped me put this together. Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and so many others. So many people fought so hard. This is a big day. We'll see how it all turns out. We have to get the final word down in concrete. Very importantly, I look forward to having the hostages come home to their parents and having some of the hostages, unfortunately, you know the condition they're in, come home likewise to their parents, because their parents wanted them just as much as though that young man or young woman were alive. So I just want to let you know that this is a very special day, maybe unprecedented in many ways. It is unprecedented. But thank you all, and thank you all to those great countries that helped. We were given a tremendous amount of help. Everybody was unified in wanting this war to end and seeing peace in the Middle East. And we're very close to achieving that. Thank you all, and everybody will be treated fairly.
And joining us now is NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, Hamas also seems to be saying that they are ready to start meeting immediately to iron out the details. Do you see any sticking points ahead here?
There are always going to be sticking points. There are many logistics that need to be worked out. Hamas didn't address all 20 of the points in President Trump's peace plan, but it did agree to the main ones. It did agree to the key principles that Hamas would leave power in Gaza, and critically that it would give back the hostages, that it would hand over all of the hostages that it still has, living and dead. And Hamas is believed to have 48 hostages, 20 of them presumed to be still alive. And Hamas officials said that it can't logistically do that in the next 72 hours, but that it is willing to enter into negotiations so that the logistics can be worked out. In the past, when there have been ceasefires, it did take some time for Hamas to gather the hostages, to work out a handover point with the Red Cross, and to actually make that transaction take place because Gaza is so devastated. There's poor communications, there are blocked roads.
So maybe some of those points. And this was obviously before the release actually happened into these prior. There's a lot to unpack. The main thing is that the phase one or initial part of the proposed 20-point plan was agreed to. And the main thing that was really being looked at initially was release all the hostages and then subsequently disarm, and that Hamas would no longer be an armed military.
Hamas never agreed to the disarm part, by the way. They only agreed to the phase one, which is the hostages for prisoner exchange.
And they have kept their word to a point, although not surprisingly to me, they are having a hard time locating all the bodies. I can't imagine how good a job they've done over a 2-year period storing bodies of the hostages that died. And so when I heard they were going to release all the hostages, including the deceased, I immediately started wondering if there'd be an issue with them retrieving everybody. The first part of it, of course, as we'll see in the next segments we're going to be posting, the compilation videos. Obviously, the hostages were released that were alive, but we're still having a challenge in having the bodies of the remaining hostages, quote unquote, found and released and transported back to Israel.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the 20 living hostages were released. That's the most important thing. They're finally back with their families. So far, they released 4, and then I think there was another 2 and another 2. Right. So I think there are still 19 bodies missing. Yes, obviously with the devastation Gaza has been through, it may be hard to find bodies. But also, it's not like they were storing them. They just buried them and sent the location on WhatsApp. So marked the location somehow. It's worth noting that to Hamas, they understand that these bodies are the most valuable, aside from the living hostages they had, are the most valuable possessions that they could have to guarantee their survival. So I think that they probably know where more of them are than they let out. They are asking for additional things. Israel says that they have info probably from the live hostages where some of at least 10 of the deceased bodies will be. So hopefully the rest of the deceased bodies will be coming. It is a tactic for Hamas to stall. My question to you, though, why do you think Hamas agreed to this? Right? After years and years of fighting, the best card they had was these hostages, right? Both alive and dead. Why did they just go ahead and give it up out of nowhere? What do you think?
I don't think it was out of nowhere. I think they were pressured. I think the key to this was that Trump was able to get other Arab countries, Muslim countries, to essentially force Hamas to do this. It's not like they were given a choice because, and I do believe that if it wasn't for things unfolding the way they did, if the nuclear power of Iran wasn't removed, this would never happen. Okay, they would not be disarming. They wouldn't return the hostages because they had Iran backing all of this. Iran got substantially degraded. They don't have the power. No matter what nonsense they're going to say, they are not at the same point they were a year ago. Okay, so Iran that was backing all this isn't there. So the big bully in the background can't step forward and do whatever. The same thing with the Houthis and all the other groups that were sending lobbing missiles left and center at Israel. They've gotten kicked around so bad. If all of these things had not happened, if Israel had not been so decisive, and they also hadn't taken out so many people, including so many leaders of the Hamas terror group and leaders in Iran, and the bottom line is this would never happen. It just, all the pieces fit in together. And then the United States, through Trump, they were able to, through negotiations, get these Arab countries to step up and do the unprecedented, which even though, as we know, they're trying to play the game on both sides. They want to be friends with the US, but they're funneling money and so forth to all these different terroristic activities. The bottom line is the thought process was with the United States. What do these other countries need that's more important to them than supporting Hamas and supporting what's going on over there? Because remember, the people running Hamas don't live in the Gaza Strip. They're not living there. They have people living there that are running the operations, but the real people in power, they're safe, very far away, living luxurious lifestyles and being funded very well. So those people had a talking to saying, look, this got to stop for now. I think the biggest challenge is the ideology isn't eradicated. The way people are thinking on the street hasn't changed. And a lot of the people, they're going to probably be upset that there's some sort of agreement. What do you mean Israel's still going to be there? That's not right. This is being forced upon them. And there's going to be a lot of strife, because when you're convinced that the only way forward is getting rid of Israel, now you're being told that Hamas isn't going to be in charge and you're going to have to change everything. And don't worry, we're going to rebuild your home, because as the masses were coming back to where they lived, and it's just like a big hole in the ground, people are disillusioned. So what happens after something like this typically is there's a tremendous opportunity for civil war, for all kinds of factions, which we are starting to see, which we'll cover in just a little bit as we move along through this. But these are expected things. It's not like the US government and these other governments aren't strategically planning for the inevitable, because when you take away the power of one group, the other groups, which are maybe one or two notches down from them, they're going to try to rise up and they're going to try to fight. So that's going to happen. There is going to be some continued jostling and fighting in the streets. But I think that Hamas, the only reason this happened is they were told, you got to cut this out for now. We have to move forward a different way. And I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't told, don't worry, this is just a temporary setback. We'll get everything we can from the West. We're going to go and we're going to rebuild. We're going to have a beautiful place to live here, all kinds of things. You'll be taken care of, and we will eventually rise again. Not surprised if there's the majority of people are thinking that's the thing. They're taking just a step back. And as you've discussed numerous times, in Islam, the way of thinking is it's the long game. Okay? It doesn't matter if you lose a battle. It's because they're viewing everything they do in the service of Allah, of God. So basically, whatever amount of time it takes, even if you have to take a step back, if this is what it takes in their minds to move forward eventually, they will take this step back. They will release the hostages. They'll do whatever, because to them, it's just a bump in the road. And I think that's the mindset. The only way that can change is if, again, substantial change happens, a generation or two go by, and it's somehow remain calm, and the newer generation of people grew up seeing something very different and saying, wait a minute, Israel isn't a problem. They're not attacking us. This isn't a problem. We don't have to keep living the way that our ancestors did, and we don't have to have all this hate. We don't know if that'll happen. And I think right now the most important thing
is key there. Re-education and really absolutely. Religion to evolve. Christianity has evolved from some problematic texts. Judaism has evolved from problematic texts, and so has many other religions. Islam has not. Islam doesn't believe in evolving. What we really need is to see moderate Islam, which is extremely rare and is really held by like the leaders of the UAE. But what we need is their version of Islam to become the more dominant version. And that's really the only true hope. I think you very eloquently answered my question there. There are 2 points you alluded to, but I think deserve a little bit more emphasis. One is, like you mentioned, Israel, aside from devastating Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran, really just brought Iran to its knees. Israel completely crushed Hamas. Now, yes, it's true Hamas has hired 20,000 more gangbangers, because anybody who wants to make a living in Gaza, the only way to make a living is through Hamas. But the average age of the new Hamas terrorists is 16 years old. And they have no training, they have no knowledge. What Israel has done is they've systematically destroyed the entire military of Hamas. So Hamas had battalions and brigades, tens of thousands of people that were very well trained. In Iran, they had military tacticians and strategists, and Israel eliminated every single person with a name, basically. Anybody from before the war who existed on any radar, with any intel, with any brains. They destroyed all of Hamas's factories, weapon factories for missiles, for other weapons, for mortars, and the entire military infrastructure and governmental infrastructure of Hamas. So that obviously is one thing that enabled this, of course, if not the consistent pressure from the heroes in the IDF fighting this war against radical Islam. This obviously, of course, couldn't have happened. The second point, though, is Israel bombed Qatar. Now, ironically, the bombing of Qatar was a failure. They wanted to get the leaders of Hamas that were in Qatar and that are in Qatar, but supposedly they were able to get out last moment. Israel notified the Americans notified the Qataris. The Qataris said, we didn't even hear about it until 10 minutes after our capital exploded. A building in our capital exploded. But I think more likely they did have advanced knowledge and probably leaked it somehow to Hamas, which is how some of the leaders of Hamas got out. But the critical thing is not that Israel succeeded or failed in killing these Hamas leaders in Qatar. The critical thing is that Israel bombed Qatar. And why is that critical? Because it's a paradigm shift. Until now, these Gulf monarchies, especially Qatar, who's a very staunch advocate for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the mother group of Hamas and ISIS, and has been funding them and helping them in every way possible. But they're also a close ally of the United States, and the United States' largest Air Force base is there too. They always like playing both balls. They're close friends with Iran, but then they also love Saudi Arabia. That's why Saudi Arabia started a war with them a few years back. What this bombing has showed them is that Israel ain't playing games anymore. Even though you have an American Air Force base, and the Americans knew about this bombing coming. And if the bombing was more successful, Trump may have even taken some credit or something, right? Because that's the way Trump is, right? When Israel attacked Iran, Trump basically gave them 12 days to go ahead and demolish Iran. And only after he saw that it was a huge success did he send the B-2s in. If Israel would have failed bombing Iran, then Trump would have said, oh, I've got nothing to do with this. Like at the very beginning of the war, Trump did say, or Marco Rubio said, we're aware of it, but we have nothing to do with it. Once he saw that it was a huge success, he sent it the B-2s and he took credit. And listen, credit where credit is due. The B-2s are marvelous. Trump is a decisive decision maker who made the right decision at the right time. And it's phenomenal, right? But that is the way Trump operates. But what Qatar understood is that this game is over and that they're going to be under pressure if they don't get rid of Hamas. So now Qatar has to get rid of Hamas. The other close ally of Hamas, huge ally of Hamas, unfortunately, is Turkey. Turkey historically was a very secular Muslim country. It was one of the first countries to recognize Israel because under Ataturk, it was extremely secular and religion was basically banned because Islam, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, was like, maybe there is something wrong because the proof of Islam's success is that Islam is successful in conquering the world. This kind of the proof that Muhammad was a true prophet is that he was so successful in conquest. If we've been failing so far and the Europeans are so much more advanced, then maybe there's something wrong with us. Let's rethink things. So Turkey was a very secular country until the current dictator / president Recep Tayyip Erdogan came into power, and he's an Islamist, and he's a radical Islamist who's in full support of Hamas, and he's a staunch member or supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's been radicalizing not just the youth and the people in Turkey, but when I spent some time living in Albania, he actually was building mosques there because Albania is a former communist country associated with the Soviet Union. Even though it's technically Muslim, the people there didn't know the difference between Sunni and Shia. They barely were Muslim aside from saying mashallah. Sweetest people you can imagine, but they were Muslim in name only, let's just say. And comes Erdogan and starts building mosques there because he's trying to radicalize the youth, right? And he's a strong proponent of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Turkey, Hamas has headquarters as well. So that's why this is so critical. Turkey and Qatar just realized that basically the gloves are off, and therefore they realize it's time to make pressure Hamas to actually accept this deal. The question is, how come this didn't happen earlier in the war? I was advocating from the beginning of the war when the protests were in Israel. I was saying, don't protest in Israel. Go to the US, go to the EU, protest in front of these Qatari and Turkey embassies, because these are the people who can actually free the hostages. If you protest in Tel Aviv, Israel's doing whatever they can to get the hostages anyways. It's not going to help. If, however, you instead protest and put pressure on these countries that actually can do something about it, then there's a lot better chance of success there. Obviously, to sweeten the deal, Trump said that he's going to give the Turks the F-35, which could be problematic since they have the S-400 Russian air defense system, and anybody who understands military technology, and it's just very problematic. Is the United States, Trump gave Qatar basically Article 5 level NATO defense pact. So both of these countries basically got a very sweet deal in order to force Hamas to accept this. So that is something that's worth mentioning. You also mentioned that this is that Hamas only accepted phase one. The phases of disarming and dismantling and going away, they haven't officially accepted that. But that's why they were willing to release the best card that they had, which is the hostages in the first place. What's really amazing is that earlier we were mentioning 2005 and Israel's withdrawal and everything like that. Israel went through 2 intifadas, uprisings, where buses were being blown up by terrorists wearing suicide vests, left, right, and center. Coffee shops were being blown up. I was almost killed when a terrorist blew up the Sbarro pizzeria in Jerusalem. People went out to have pizza. Somebody went in with a suicide vest and blew up 37 people or something, right? So Israel went through literally decades of experiencing this. And then they still, in 2005, said, okay, we're going to uproot our families, our communities, our graves, over 8,000 people, beautiful towns and cities on the beaches of Gaza. We're going to uproot the graves, and we're going to pull everybody out in order to have that chance of peace. And the idea is, a lot of people compare this, oh, look at the IRA, they put down their arms. Why can't, this same thing happen here? And it's because it wasn't very much a religious. Yes, they had the Protestants and the Catholics, but it was much more of a land dispute, of a border dispute, than it was this complete annihilation type of idea. So it is very problematic to compare it, I think, to the IRA, don't you think?
Yeah, it's not exactly the same. And as a child growing up, I would be like, I don't understand. They both believe in God and they both believe in Jesus. And there's some religious war going on between the Protestants. It isn't quite what's going on here. I agree. But maybe to use that same example, that Israel was able to do the unthinkable in uprooting its own people and literally uprooting the deceased and removing them out of grave sites, which is unheard of. They removed every semblance of presence to seed the land, as we were talking about a few minutes ago. But to go to those extremes, I think if we flip the story around, that's what's happening with Qatar and that's what's happening with Turkey. And that they're like saying, you know what? They're looking at it was impressed upon them, the bigger, broader picture, and what sacrifice has to be made now for them to be able to reap these benefits. Qatar has another thing that they're getting, which is some military training base in the United States. Never have we had a foreign power, I think, just come here and have. So there's something going on with that. Ultimately, they are being guaranteed protection because they're worried that there's going to be people within the Arab world maybe that are not going to be happy about what's happening. And the United States is going to have their back to be able to allow them to get this to happen. There's some precarious things that are being done, but I think much like Israel took that huge step to cede the land, these countries are they're looking not 1 and 2 years down the road. They're looking 10, 20 years. They're understanding what the consequences will be if they stay on the same road versus if they take this new path. And the other point you had brought up earlier, and that we talked about, that I also mentioned, as people on the streets in Gaza were being interviewed, can you change an ideology in people's minds? And obviously time is required for that, right? People aren't just going to suddenly change the way they think. But if we think back, certainly in the United States history and in other countries, we had segregation. There were real problems here in this country, which now it's not that there's none, but you can't even compare it. And then the same thing, even though you mentioned that, yeah, the Nazi soldiers, a lot of them had real issues in dealing because they were human and they just couldn't believe what they were being asked and forced and ordered to do. But the reality is there were people growing up in Germany who despised Jews and felt that was normal because that's what they were taught from day one. And there's a lot of examples. To a lesser extent, I could tell you, Canada had the British and the French fighting, and the French lost essentially, but a large contingency of French remained in Canada, in places like Quebec, where I grew up. And I met people that despised the English. They only spoke French. They refused to learn English. They wanted nothing to do with any English-speaking Canadians because they really were taught for generations to hate them. Much like at one point, the French and the British were mortal enemies fighting war, which now, of course, that's not the way it is. And so I do think that there's hope that if done right, and if everybody was able to do the things they need to do and keep things going, with time, there may be an opportunity. If this wasn't done, there would never be an opportunity. The next compilation we have is really segues a little more into Hostages Square and imminently before the hostages were released. I think we can show that and talk a little more about that as we move along.
And Jennifer, it's pretty interesting that Jared Kushner with Witkoff was part of this duo that really drove this to the president's desk. Jared Kushner obviously instrumental in the Abraham Accords, which no one thought was possible in the first term. And people wondered whether Jared would have much involvement at all in the second term. And here, only, 8 months, 9 months into the administration, this is a pretty pivotal achievement.
A huge achievement, and certainly Jared Kushner's achievement as the negotiator of the Abraham Accords in the first Trump term. He has a lot of credibility in the Middle East, and he has used that, as you've heard President Trump say, that this into the Gaza war is just the first phase of what he sees as a broader Middle East peace plan, if you will, that would broaden the Abraham Accords. That certainly is what is motivating Jared Kushner. Steve Witkoff has been at the center of hostage negotiations, has brought many of those hostages out from Gaza as well as around the world. There have been hostage releases, but it would not have happened without President Trump bringing, remember when
to find the
Prime
criminal
Minister
conspiracy.
Okay. I'm just given. Yeah, I was just given a note by the Secretary of State saying that we're very close to a deal in the Middle East, and they're going to need me pretty quickly, so I will take a couple of more questions.
It is important to note before we say anything else, but none of this happens without Donald Trump in the White House. If Donald Trump is not president, this does not happen. The opposite happens. That's what happened when Joe Biden was in office. It was war through weakness. Now it's peace through strength. The president posting on Truth Social that Israel and Hamas have agreed to the first phase of a peace deal and that all remaining hostages will be freed this weekend. Saturday is when this is going to happen, reportedly. The president saying, "I am very proud to announce that Israel and Hamas have both signed off on the first phase of our plan. This means that all of the hostages will be released very soon, and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed upon line as the first step towards a strong, durable, everlasting peace."
It's a really significant first step, and I really commend President Trump and his administration, as well as Arab leaders in the region, for making the commitment to the 20-point plan and seeing a path forward for what's often called the day after. Most importantly, the conflict hopefully will end with the ceasefire. The hostages will be returned. And then the very hard work of rebuilding Gaza, of finding the kind of security that Israel and the Palestinians after Hamas deserve to have, moving forward with the other points in the plan to try to create an opportunity for Palestinians to have a better life and for Israel to have greater peace and security. I am very hopeful that we'll be able to see progress. Today's a good start, but we have to keep going from here.
We all owe a debt of deep gratitude to President Trump. In the worst of times, he refused to accept the idea that peace in the Mideast was out of reach. He brought together nations once divided. He brought together nations once divided by generations of conflict and showed us that shared peace is stronger than shared pain. History will remember that when others doubted, President Trump believed. He is the greatest president in American history, and we're here because of him. He showed the world that strength and peace go hand in hand. They are not opposites, they are partners. To the Arab leaders and partners of ours who meant so much in this negotiation, including President Erdogan from Turkey, including Sheikh Mohammed from Qatar, including the Emir, including President Sisi, all of whom played a critical and an integral role in this peace deal.
The president
I say thank you.
wanted me to share, as he has with so many of you personally, that he sees you, he hears you, he stands with you, always, always. The return of each hostage is not only a moment of homecoming and relief, it's a triumph of faith, of courage, and of our shared humanity.
Powerful.
Yeah, very. What a piece of TV history that is, being able to see the Secretary of State giving him the piece of paper. And actually, some of the cameras were able to take a snapshot of exactly what it says there. Basically, it said, hey, we need you to come out and make a true social post so that we can go ahead, so that you're first to announce the peace deal. And then he just said it right there on stage. It's just a phenomenal piece of TV history, don't you think?
Absolutely. Totally.
And then I really do think that this is like true leadership and real visionary. Like Trump, from the very beginning, told the families he met with the families of the hostages, and he told them that he's going to get their hostages out. Biden gave them a hug and said, I care. Fakely, maybe, but at least he said, I care. He didn't have any leadership. He had no vision. Where that's really the difference between a leader and a follower. Biden was a follower in his best of days, not when he had dimension to know what was right in front of his face, right? Trump is a true leader. He really did care. He cares about so many things and about so many people. And obviously, with the art of the deal, he is very good at negotiating. He gives these people tons and tons of compliments. Basically, unless you personally offend him, he will give you lots of compliments and a lot of respect. And he just expects the same in return. And as long as you give it to him, he'll play ball. He won't always be nice, but at least he will publicly give you lots of compliments. Everybody's his best friend. He loves everybody, which is awesome. That's the way to treat other leaders if you want them to work with you, right? If you just piss all over their faces every day and tell them that they're assholes, which may be true, they may not want to work with you. And if in this world, you've got to work with people in order to find success. Really, I think huge respect for Trump because he actually cared. I think it's also worth noting that this happened basically the moment that Ivanka and Jared Kushner got involved. I respect Steve Witkoff a lot. I think he's a good-hearted person. He just lacks a tremendous amount of kind of history and knowledge and geopolitical kind of information. And he was also so busy with basically every conflict in the world. But what Trump recently mentioned is that he's really good at building personal relationships with leaders. And I think that's really critical. I think what Kushner has is this brilliant kind of insight. And he's just a brilliant man, just a way of figuring out a path that can really work. I think the brilliance in this idea, like you mentioned earlier, is the fact that he was able to get almost every single Muslim, every single Arab country on board with it. That's a huge accomplishment. Like we said, this wouldn't have happened if not for Israel's accomplishments. It wouldn't have happened if not for the U.S. bombing Iran. Sure. It wouldn't have happened even if not for Iran bombing Qatar. And this is worth noting because Qatar was always like, we'll stand on the fence. We won't take a side because that way we can negotiate with both sides, right? We like playing both sides of the wall. And what they realized is that after the Americans bombed Iran, the Iranians bombed Qatar, or the American base in Qatar. But it was a personal offense to Qatari Emir, right? And now they were bombed by the Israelis, and suddenly they're like, maybe standing on the fence isn't so worth it after all. So I think that's really important.
I think
the last thing that was mentioned was, I think when Hillary Clinton was speaking, she said that she wishes for security for the Palestinians. There will be security for the Palestinians if they stop attacking and trying to kill Jews. There may be fights between the different clans. That's something very different. That's why Mordechai Kedar thinks he's a brilliant researcher on the topic. And he basically says the only natural form of governance that works in the Middle East is the clan format, is the tribal format. And that's why the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are successful, A, because they have oil, but also because there's actually respect for leadership unlike every other Muslim country where the Muslims despise the leadership, because in Islam, there's no such thing as recognition of the state. The states are illegal according to Islam. Like, the fact that you're the president of the state is illegal by Islam. So it's like, who are you? Your entire existence is false and is not allowed. Whereas this clan structure, the kind of based on the family and kind of these extended families, that is what's natural in the Arab world. And that's really the only form of governance that actually works. So hopefully we can divvy things up that way. And it could be the United Emirates of Palestine or something someday long in the future. But it really has to be like Emirates based on family groups, because that seems to be the only thing that will work. If the West or even other Arab countries trying to impose a new government, even if it's run by Muslims, even if it's a quote unquote reformed version of the Palestinian Authority, they won't accept it. Just like the Palestinians don't accept the Palestinian Authority, because according to them, the Palestinian Authority has no authority over them because it's a state or a wannabe state, and that is not allowed according to Islam.
Yeah, and these are all things that, again, have to play out and are really important in understanding the broader, deeper issues that I think a lot of times are glossed over. People, oh, we'll just put in some new government and we'll have somebody appointed and it's all good and we'll have elections and everyone will be happy. And it's not quite that straightforward. Although there are surprising things, like to have Hillary Clinton and in the background there Condoleezza Rice. And ultimately, even Bill Clinton came forward and gave kudos to President Trump. Interestingly, Obama tippy-toed around mentioning Trump's name. He didn't really. And there's other people that are still in elected office now who, as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, have been very silent. The contingencies that have been screaming, end the Intifada, stop the genocide, all these things, where are they now?
Ceasefire now.
Shouldn't they be celebrating in the streets? Shouldn't there be this massive celebration? The war is over. Yay, peace. Where are they? In fact, here in the United States, we're going to have the No Kings rally this weekend. Again, nobody seems to be like they forgot about it. It's over on to the next thing. What else? Oh, what can we do? Oh, let's have another No Kings Day rather than celebrate peace. Why aren't we all celebrating peace? What in the world? Where did all those people go that were screaming in the streets and waving flags? And I don't get it. In fact, you were recently traveling in Spain, and you took a video that you sent to me. I'd like to put that up. We can speak over it. And you told me a little bit about what you encountered. Let me put that up and you can tell me what that was all about. Let me pull that up here. It won't have any sound. It'll just show that video. This is a video that you took. Go ahead and let's put it up.
Yeah, a few months ago, I was traveling in the magnificently beautiful city of Valencia in Spain, and I was walking through a park and I came out an exit and suddenly there was this pro-Palestine protest. I would have loved to speak to and engage with the people there, but unfortunately most of them speak Catalan and my Spanish isn't that great, let alone my Catalonian. Plus, I think a lot of the people there are just very ingrained in their thought process and you can't necessarily talk them out of anything. But there were a lot of people there, and there were a lot of people traveling there. A lot of people wearing the keffiyehs, which I think, like we see right here, I think is cultural appropriation. Don't you think that? Wasn't that looked upon by all of these people right here? So suddenly it became allowed. Recently, I started calling the Palestinian flag the international flag of jihadist conquest, because that really is what these people don't realize. But I think that really is kind of what this flag symbolizes. And I think that's why we're seeing this flag being flown all over the world. The more you see Muslim populations in different countries, the more you'll see the Palestinian flag. It's not so much about standing for Palestine. Again, they don't really care if there's a Palestinian state or not. It's really more about the destruction of the Jewish state. But like we mentioned in previous episodes, in Islam, there's this dichotomy. The world is divided between the house of war and the house of Islam. Basically, anywhere that's not majority Islam is a war zone. You may not realize it, but it is a war zone. Maybe they haven't gotten to you yet, but they plan on getting to you at some period. And I think anywhere where they can mark their territory, they'll go ahead and they'll plant that flag. So I think in many occasions, it really represents where Islam is conquering the West, unless we stand and support Palestine. Yeah, what do you think about that kind of idea? I've never heard that term before. I think that's something that I've made up, but I think the international flag of jihadist conquest really is what the Palestinian quote-unquote flag is. The flag was basically taken from the Jordanian flag. They just removed a star. They have copied almost everything that is Palestinian. Right. That's a topic for another discussion, I guess.
That is. And listen, ultimately, it's interesting. And you really see, again, there was all these college campuses with everybody chanting from the river to the sea. That if you ask them, what do you mean by that? I don't know. Everyone else was saying it. They just don't understand.
Yeah, what river, what sea? Yeah, and like you were mentioning, they've been protesting for years, literally, ceasefire now, and now there's a ceasefire, and there was a humongous protest in Sydney recently, and they were like, no, the war should continue. We're not
Yeah,
going to settle until Israel is gone and the Jews are killed, basically.
It's ridiculous.
It's like the purest evidence that this isn't really about
Right.
Palestine. It really is about conquering in the name of Islam, and the stupid people who go along with it, right? This Green-Red Alliance. Like we saw all of Iran, etc.
There wasn't and hasn't been throughout the world, and certainly in the United States, endless partying and celebration. The war is over, there's peace, the hostages, at least the live hostages thus far, and a few of the deceased have been released. Why are we not celebrating all that everywhere? All these same people that were basically screaming that Israel needed to bring peace to the Middle East, and now there's peace. Now what? Crickets. That's just, again, they're hoping people aren't going to notice. They're hoping people are going to move on to the next thing. Again, here, the No Kings Rally, a second edition coming this Saturday. Look, I think it's important as we've been watching this unfold and we play some of these clips that we've collected over the last 2 weeks. I'm going to put up another one as we progress along to the segue of the actual release of the hostages. Let me put this up next.
It was an astonishing feat, celebrated both in the streets of Gaza and in the streets of Tel Aviv and beyond.
Blessed be the peacemakers. God bless you, Mr. President. God bless America.
Thank you very much. You just take care of yourselves. The hostages will come back. They're all coming back on Monday.
Just consider for a minute what it takes to end a war and to have both sides hail you as a hero. Consider the resistance Trump had to overcome on both sides. From Israel's side, you had Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has resisted calls to end the war since it began, at times even calls from the majority of Israelis. He was put in the unenviable position of navigating the dual imperatives of the war, bringing back the hostages on the one hand and putting an end to Hamas on the other. And these were always in conflict with each other, a horrific Sophie's choice. Netanyahu seemed to have chosen finishing Hamas over rescuing hostages. It took President Trump, who together with First Lady Melania was deeply moved by the plight of the hostage families, to tell Netanyahu in no uncertain terms that the time had come to choose the hostages and to end the war. And this truly was no easy feat. Netanyahu has for decades outmaneuvered American presidents, resisting their pressure and enraging them in the process. But Trump had two advantages. His own popularity in Israel no doubt made Netanyahu hesitant to cross him. And Trump also knew that the Israeli people were ready for the war to be over. 2/3 of Israelis, the highest number since the war began, want it to end. Moreover, Trump has been bothered by Israel's loss of support, both stateside and worldwide. Trump saw the deal as a way of bringing Israel back into the fold amidst cratering support.
Brought the whole world together. It's amazing. I've never seen anything. It's so good for Israel. I spoke to Bibi Netanyahu just a little while ago. He called. He said, I can't believe it. He said, everybody's liking me now. Meaning him. He said, I said, more importantly, they're loving Israel again. And they really are. I said, Israel cannot fight the world, baby. They can't fight the world.
None of this is to say that Trump doesn't understand the threat of Hamas or was sanguine about a deal that didn't neuter the terrorist organization. But while conventional wisdom cast Hamas as a military problem, Trump began to see it as a diplomatic one. If he could get Qatar and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Turkey to take responsibility for Gaza and for getting rid of the threat posed by the terrorist group, then the second imperative of the war, ending Hamas, could be similarly accomplished just by different means. By reframing Hamas not as a military problem of Israel's, but as a diplomatic problem of the Arabs, Trump found a way to align what were the competing imperatives of the war. And when Bibi balked at the terms of the deal, Trump was adamant, take the win. So how did Trump get the Arabs on board? Well, there are 3 rules to Trump's deal making. Ignore the experts, align the interests of the two sides, and play the long game, pivoting when necessary and taking that win whenever you can. In this case, he ignored the conventional wisdom that the conflict is about competing value systems and that what the Muslim countries want more than anything else is an end to Israel. Instead, Trump focused on the fact that the Muslim states in play each wanted something from him. Egypt wanted American military aid and for the Gazans to stay put in Gaza and not flood Sinai. Qatar wanted an apology from Netanyahu for an Israeli airstrike, and Turkey wanted sanctions relief. Most importantly, Trump had convinced the Gulf Arab states in an early trip to the region that he respected them and had their best interests at heart, despite his avowed and unapologetically pro-Israel stance. While bragging about being the most pro-Israel president in American history, Trump courted trillions of dollars in investments to intertwine our economies with those of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and used tariffs to incentivize those investments going to our industrial base. In other words, Trump's economic agenda and his foreign policy agenda are intertwined, something the president himself acknowledged.
The tariffs have brought peace to the world. I'm telling you, they brought peace to the world. And not only here, but with so many other deals. You know, I've made 7 peace deals, at least 5 of the 7 that we've done so far. It was through trade. That we're not going to deal with people that fight. We're not going to deal, and we're going to put tariffs on you. It gives you a tremendous road to peace and the saving of millions of lives.
President Obama put out this post talking about the peace deal and the prospects of it, and Don Jr. responded to it. I'll finish it for you. Thank you, Donald Trump. Honestly, it's not unfair to say if President Obama's going to write a whole post about a peace deal, maybe he should acknowledge the president that brokered it.
Point, standing defiant even when people doubted the prime minister could do it, and the enormous pressure he faced at home and internationally. Prime Minister Netanyahu is on the brink of fulfilling a moral, human, and Jewish obligation of bringing the innocent hostages back home. The hostages who were brutally taken by uncivilized people in Gaza, led by terror organizations that have nothing but hatred towards Jews, Israelis, the Jewish state, and Western civilization. Now, while the IDF has redeployed to the new yellow line in Gaza in full force during this ceasefire and the 72-hour time window that we are currently in for Hamas to release all of our hostages, we pay tribute to the soldiers currently serving on the ground, and we will always remember the brave and heroic soldiers who dropped everything in their lives to fight for the state of Israel and our hostages, leading us to the point where we are now. We remember the 915 IDF soldiers who gave their lives for us to get to this point. May their memories forever be a blessing. Now, President Trump's global leadership and intense pressure he applied to get Hamas to agree to this plan, with the first phase approved, the prime minister said it put the sword on its neck, as it was the first time the terror group agreed to release all 48 of our hostages at one time. I remind you of the international leaders that told Israel not to go into Gaza City. And with the help from our great friends Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, their dedication and personal missions to bring home our people speaks volumes to the incredible team President Trump has built. Here's what I can tell you about the release of our hostages, and let's be very clear about something. Israel has been ready since Saturday night to receive our hostages. A report that came out from the Wall Street Journal suggests that Hamas is willing to release the hostages as soon as today. This is not a gesture of kindness from Hamas, Let's remember, they took our people as hostages, starved and tortured them in captivity, and even murdered some in captivity as well. Hamas could have released our hostages 2 years ago. So the Prime Minister's response? Israel is prepared and is ready to immediately receive all of our hostages. The release of our hostages will begin early Monday morning. We are expecting all 20 of our living hostages to be released together at one time to the Red Cross and transported among 6 to 8 vehicles without any sick displays by Hamas, the terror organization. The hostages will then be driven to forces inside of Israeli-controlled parts of Gaza and then transferred to the Re'im base in southern Israel, where they will then reunite with their families. Israel is ready. If a living hostage requires any urgent medical attention, they will be brought to a medical facility.
This great and historic achievement we celebrate today, including the soon-to-be release of these hostages. Some have been murdered, tortured, starved, sexually abused by these subhuman monsters, throwbacks to the 7th century, these barbarians, these primitives, in the war between civilization in the 7th century. The fact is, their release, when it happens, should be widely celebrated, period.
It should. And yet, many of the voices we heard for 2 years are nowhere to be found.
Or they're still protesting against Israel and for Hamas.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It speaks, their silence speaks volumes, okay? It just obviously does. And again, Mark Levin, his point is well taken. The acts on October 7th were barbaric and a throwback to medieval times. No civilized people of this day and age could even imagine what was done. This is not a regular war. This was unthinkable, horrific, unspeakable things that were done. We can't forget that. I won't. It was on my birthday. Never going to forget.
Yeah, sorry for wrecking your birthday.
Yeah, but I guess the good news is the hostages were released on my dad's birthday, which was, when he was alive, his birthday was October 13th. Isn't that poetic?
Yeah, it is poetic. And what's also poetic is that the terror attack on October 7th is the English kind of date. The Hebrew date is the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, celebrating the Torah, or the books of Moses. The hostages were released, and Trump came to the Knesset and had this phenomenal speech. I think we may play parts of it later, on eve of Simchat Torah, exactly 2 years later. So it took Israel exactly 2 years to completely devastate, after the most brutal attack it ever faced, and the longest war in all of its history, to pose a serious comeback, destroying all of its enemies, essentially. And thanks to Trump, really, this phenomenal comeback. I think at the end there, we were seeing a speech of the Prime Minister's spokesperson in Hebrew that was dubbed in English. Isn't that weird? Israel gets criticized a lot for failing in the propaganda war and the public affairs war. And Israel is obviously really losing in that front. One of the reasons, notably, is that the fact that for the last 2 years, the Prime Minister has not had an English spokesperson. Yeah, which kind of explains the odd dubbing there. And obviously, the main reason why Israel is hated around the world is because there are 2 billion people who by default basically hate Israel and most Jews. And then you have the neo-Nazis, you have the communists, that's another billion people who by default hate Israel. So the odds are really stacked against Israel regardless, but not having an English spokesperson definitely isn't helping out. I think she mentioned that this wouldn't have happened, obviously, without the Israeli soldiers who dropped everything and ran first and foremost to join the fight. And this is what's important for most people to realize, is that Israel is a tiny country and they don't have enough people to have a standing army full time. So what they do, like a lot of countries like Switzerland and a lot of Nordic countries, is they have a huge reserve force. People will serve in the military when they're young, and they'll occasionally have some training for maybe a week or two every year just to stay in put. But really, day to day, these people are regular civilians. They're running businesses. They have stores, restaurants, and they just regular person. They're your regular dad. They're raising their children. They're the average Joe. And when a war comes and your home is being attacked and your family is being raped, you drop everything and you run to that special place in the closet in your room, and you pull out that bag that you prayed you would never need and you would never see and you would never use with your old uniform, and you go to a base and you get ammunition and you go to fight. So the vast majority of the soldiers fighting in this war are not a standing military. The vast majority are just your average Joe who got up to defend their family. And that's something that's really important. Hopefully we will never be in the situation where we face that ourselves. What Trump said, that this happened thanks to the tariffs, that is 100% true. The US has such amazing economic might. And under the Biden administration, we were losing that economic might. And under the Obama administration, we were losing that.
We had pretty much lost it. We were
Yeah,
using it effectively.
we were still
We didn't have it as a lever. We didn't have it
economy.
as a fulcrum to be able to get these things to happen. In fact, we covered
100%.
months ago, we were talking about these meetings that the Trump administration was having with Qatar and all these different Arab nations, how a plane was being essentially loaned, gifted, or whichever way you want to describe, to be used as Air Force One. And people were like in shock. They didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand that he was laying the framework then to essentially be able to have the interconnection of the economy of the United States and the world with these countries, that there was going to be this back and forth, that they needed us and that we would be able to benefit them. They would get something out of this. People focused on the aircraft that was being given or what have you, but they weren't focusing on all the other things necessary. And there's huge investments that are being made in the United States. With that, months later, you could see how now all this came full circle and was used to benefit the region. In fact, those countries are benefiting in a big way, and they're being made. Trump has mentioned more than one occasion that some of the countries that have been involved in brokering this don't want their names mentioned, didn't really want their names mentioned. But then there was a summit right after Trump spoke at the Knesset in Israel. He went and obviously had world leaders there, many of which are the Arab players that ultimately were involved, because they're going to benefit from this as well. And I think given
every world leader was there in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Oh yeah,
everybody, not just every
Oh,
Arab
yeah,
leader, but
absolutely.
like from all Europe and from Canada and just
unheard
just
of. It's
like, it's
probably,
phenomenal.
I don't think there's ever been an unprecedented meeting of leaders like this, quite in this manner. And this is, again, it was a peace summit. Big word peace right at the bottom, 2025. So that everybody that was there could stand up and be proud that they're helping broker peace. And that being said, the next compilation clip that we're going to put up right now has probably the most important part of all this. It actually does cover some of the hostages actually coming home. I'd like to just put that up because that is, at the end, that's what everyone's been begging, praying, and hoping for. And I think it's incredible to see. Let me just run that real quick.
This morning, the world witnessing extraordinary scenes in Israel. The first images of those 20 Israeli hostages turned over as family members cried and crowds by the tens of thousands erupted in applause. And there were cheers for President Trump touching down today in Israel to announce to the world the hostages have been released and continue his push for a path towards peace. The homecoming and the reunions of families torn apart for more than 2 years, the first stage of the U.S. brokered peace deal. President Trump meeting with them and marking this historic moment by writing in a book at the Israeli parliament, "This is my great honor, a great and beautiful day, a new beginning." As the hostages return home, there are more stages to come in the process. 2,000 Palestinian prisoners set to be freed. And humanitarian aid starting to flow into Gaza, where the devastation of the war is unmistakable. Back in Tel Aviv, relief for the hostages returning home. But
there are some who are declining to celebrate this ceasefire. And it's interesting, some of the same people who have been asking for a ceasefire for well over 2 years, saying that Israel needs to draw back, Israel needs to stop. I don't know. Have we heard from Ilhan Omar? Have we heard from, I
checked AOC's Twitter
and
nothing.
Nothing.
So many of the squad, nothing. And that tells you everything, the hypocrisy that exists, that they can't bring themselves to say, hey, this was a good job. Our president did a good job.
president did do a phenomenal job, 100%.
The unimaginable. Most people thought it was impossible.
And just
And
like we did with the Abraham Accords in the first round, and this really is somewhat a continuation of it, because this, let's just say the expansion of the Abraham Accords to lots of other Muslim and Arab countries couldn't have happened without Iran being gotten rid of first. And some of these other countries, Qatar learning its lesson, Hamas being destroyed, Hezbollah being eradicated, because the entire Arab world was terrified, shaking in their boots, peeing their pants from Iran. Just worth reminding people that Iran bombed Saudi Arabia's entire oil refinement and cost them like billions or trillions of dollars, right? It took them months to recover. So Iran was just terrifying everybody in the entire neighborhood. So without Israel and the United States really getting rid of this, like we mentioned earlier, it really couldn't have happened. It's worth noting that Trump has, and even before this, he had a 97% approval rate in Israel. He's far more popular in Israel than he is in the United States. I think some of what we're seeing of his approval rates in the United States just don't really coincide with reality and with what actual people in the street say. I think one of the interesting things that Bibi said during the phenomenal speech right after or right before Trump spoke in the Knesset, Trump is the fourth American president in all of history to have the honor of speaking in the Israeli parliament. And he gave a fabulous speech. Definitely recommend you guys listen to it. It was a comedy skit. It was hysterical. It was funny. It was interesting. It was nonstop applause. Like we said, 97% of Israeli people support Trump. The most Knesset members really love him, aside from one Arab parliament member and one Jewish parliament member who's in the Arab Party, who tried to heckle Trump and were immediately removed. And so that was a side note. But one of the things that Bibi said is that Jews have a very long history and a very long memory. And we remember the leaders who have helped us. And Trump's name goes down in this story of the Jewish people right there along with Cyrus the Great. And I think that there may never be a greater honor than that, whether you're religious or not. Just being remembered for eternity, at least a few more thousand years, is really something special. One of the things that Batya said, and in general she's very good, is that Hamas is now no longer a security problem for Israel. Instead, it's a diplomatic problem for the Arabs. Maybe if the entire part, including phases 2 and 3 of Trump's plan, ever come to fruition, what's most important is that phase 1 happened and the hostages got home, right? Phase 2, disarming Hamas, that's the real challenge. Until that happens, there's no guarantee of anything. Unfortunately, that will have to happen. We can't count on any international police force to do anything. Just a reminder, the United Nations had forces in Lebanon that were supposed to deter Hezbollah. Instead, they were like, Hezbollah threatened them a few times, and they basically started giving in to Hezbollah and then partnering with Hezbollah and then taking bribes from Hezbollah and just hanging out and just basically partying there. And then the minute there was any threat of anything, they just run away. Same with, they were there in Syria as well, and they just run away, especially if this international force is made up of Egyptians or Indonesians. There is no way that a Muslim will kill another Muslim in defense of a Jew. I wish that was possible. Just Jewish soldiers, really the only place that does happen is in the IDF. And that's what's so special about Israel. And obviously the vice versa happens all the time. Israeli Iron Dome intercept missiles that are going to hit Arab villages all the time, right? But in the Islamic mindset, it's extremely unlikely that Arab soldiers or Muslim soldiers will go to war to fight Hamas in the name of defending Israel. So Israel still has to go ahead and clear out Hamas. It won't be easy, but that is critical for all of the rest of the parts of Trump's plan to work out. I think soon we're going to watch a clan violence. Somebody's going to have to get rid of a lot of those weapons that are there. And we can't count on anybody but the IDF doing that. Nobody else has the motivation, the drive, the will, or the ability, the knowledge of the environment, the knowledge of the culture, or anything else to make that happen aside from the IDF. So unfortunately, Israel still has to finish off Hamas. It's extremely crucial, and hopefully that will happen. Just in the last video, we saw some of the protests of get rid of Bibi, we hate Bibi, this and that. It's worth noting that the radical left in Israel funded by the Democratic Party, unfortunately, since Barack Obama came into power, at least. So I remember V15, when Obama was in power, he started funding all of these organizations to protest Bibi and to replace Bibi. So there's a very radical left-wing party in Israel. Not party even, it's just a group that are basically anybody but Bibi. I'm not necessarily Netanyahu's greatest fan, although I do think he is a leader, and not many countries have real leaders. Israel doesn't have a lot of other politicians that could be leaders, and he really is a historic leader in any kind of measurement. But a lot of these protests are funded, unfortunately, internationally, and these protesters have basically co-opted the hostage release protest, saying that the hostages will never be released if Bibi is in power. Again, thanks to Trump, that has been proven wrong, and this will reduce a lot of pressure on Israel from operating in the future. But basically, a lot of the protests have got mixed together. There are a lot of hostage parents that are like, no, we don't want ceasefire, because they were calling for ceasefire. And a lot of Israel's enemies were using this as proof. Look, Bibi is super unpopular, even though these protesters are not, there were large protests, but they don't necessarily represent that many people. Bibi is just doing it to try and hold on to power, even though the court cases against him are extremely flawed, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this was basically the just not Bibi protests that co-opted the hostage protests, which I think is very unfortunate, but it is worth recognizing because we did see some of the signs there. I just want to note that hearing Trump tell the hostage families that their loved ones will be released, seeing their excitement, it just drives chills in anybody with a heart, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Sure, totally does. And the peace deal has a lot of parts to it. And they were talking, part of it was this idea of an ISF, an international stabilization force. And like you said, no one has the appetite to send some sort of paramilitary or what have you troops over there to keep the peace when there's active fighting happening in the streets still amongst various factions of people living in Gaza. That needs to get cleared up. And whether or not Hamas truly has agreed to give up its power and its arms, that's left to be seen, and talk's cheap. But as we were mentioning before, their biggest bargaining chip was the hostages, and the living hostages was the most valuable of those bargaining chips, and they don't have that anymore. So there's a belief that something is going to move forward. They're just trying to cajole and see how they can wind up getting some benefit out of all this. And
staying in control. And they want to be at least the gang that controls the Gaza afterward.
And although Hamas gets all the publicity, so to speak, the reality is it's a very complex environment. There are other terrorist groups. There's these different clans that are there, and they each control different parts of that area. And now, as they're hearing that Hamas is being ordered to stand down, they're trying to come in and exert their powers. So it is going to be a mess for a while. Again, as expected, this wasn't going to be some clean thing because it's not just Hamas. It's no different than if you look at places like even in Mexico, where they have various cartels, and you have forces taking down one cartel, the other ones will start uprising and trying to be more powerful. They're not going to just say that our neighbors that were controlling that region are now arrested and have been quelled. We're just going to not step in. They're going to step in, as again happens just right next to us here in Mexico. We've seen
a power vacuum.
The various
somebody's going to come to fill it.
Not complicated, but that will happen. But then what do we do about it? As this unfolds, we will see. And the other part of it is that the deal involved release of the captives that were held by Hamas in exchange for captives held by Israel. And there's a lot of them, and including civilians that were post October 7th, 2023, that were arrested and have been held. And of course, actual convicted murderers, I think it's like 250 that were serving life sentences would be released, and something like 1,700 of these other detainees would be released in part. You release X amount of our people and we'll release X amount of these people. But there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes that maybe aren't really fully discussed in the evening news. It's not just, okay, it's over. There's other pieces that are still unfolding as we speak. And maybe to help understand the other nuances of this, the next video compilation, as we start moving towards wrapping up this In Focus segment, really I think it's important to hear from some other voices that have perhaps can shed some other light on what we have here. And Ben Shapiro is one of those people who I think can speak to some of these things. Let's put that up and discuss it.
Where are all the people who kept yelling about genocide? Where did they go? Seriously, where did they go? Because all the people who are screaming about genocide now, a deal is on the table that stops all of this, that frees hostages, that stops the bombing campaign in Gaza, that rolls back the Israeli military presence to a decided upon line. And they've all ghosted the internet. They're gone. They disappeared. Poof, they're just gone. It's amazing. Now, you would imagine that if you spent 2 years fighting against an actual genocide, not a fake genocide like what's happening in Gaza, which is not by any stretch of the imagination or any definition ever a genocide, but imagine that you were fighting like a real genocide, like the Rwandan genocide, and a deal happened to stop the genocide. And then all the people who were fighting to stop it just disappeared. They didn't say anything. They didn't celebrate. They didn't say this is a good thing. They didn't give credit. They didn't try to, nothing. They just go totally silent. What might that tell you about those people? The first thing would be that they don't actually care about the supposed genocide, right? That would be the thing that would immediately pop to mind, that you didn't care about that it was all a lie, that you actually had another reason that you were doing this routine. The Washington Free Beacon has an excellent rundown of many of these anti-genocide activists who have gone completely missing, like completely MIA. Mehdi Hassan over at MSNBC, right, former MSNBC personality, who now spends his days on the internet talking with wild lefties and people who like Marjorie Taylor Greene, as we'll get to in a moment, put out a statement. I love that we live in a world where we're all supposed to now praise Trump for his peacemaking and ignore the fact that at least 20,000 Palestinians have been killed on his watch with bombs and bullets and rhetorical support that he supplied to Israel. I mean, Mehdi seems pretty salty about the fact that Trump actually got to the end of this thing. He then went on to predict that Israel will violate the terms of the deal and all the rest. Like, not a moment of credit for Trump. Instead, we're supposed to be upset with Trump that the things that were necessary to get to the peace happened.
Weapons are going to be handed over only to the hands of a Palestinian state. And our fighters can be integrated into the Palestinian National Army. Before that, no one has the right to deny us the right to resist the occupation by all means.
Because Hamas is already rebranding in Gaza. Watch as they stand there, without uniforms, controlling the population. They're acting as like traffic cops, and now they're calling themselves the security forces of Gaza. Same people, same Hamas fighters. Caption reads, the Gaza people will finish you soon. This is after the announcement. So there's no shortage of people on the ground that are cajoling to find their spot, but still have a certain way of thinking. It's not going to go away overnight.
Yeah, like we said time and time again, that requires true elimination of not just Hamas, but all the terrorists there. There are dozens of factions. And then it requires complete change of the educational system and the religious indoctrination. And then maybe in 20 years, once the children from the new education system grow up, then there will be no war, right? Imagine if in World War II, we defeated the Nazis militarily, but then we still allowed them to manage the culture and the news and the school system, and they continue to indoctrinate new German children into Nazism every single year, right? We wouldn't have been finished with the Nazis, right? The only reason why we defeated the Nazis, at least there are still neo-Nazis, but at least as an organized organization, a unified organization, was because we changed the education system. And only after the children from the new education system grew up did Germany become this phenomenal society that we know it to be now. Yeah, so that's very important. The last thing we were seeing were regular Palestinians singing Khaybar Khaybar Ya Yehud, Muhammad Rasulullah, something like that, which basically means remember Jews of Khaybar. the sword of Muhammad is going to come for you. Here they changed the word to say the sword of Gaza is going to come for you. And that is reminiscent to a story from the Quran when Muhammad and his military basically massacred entire communities of Jews. There was another scenario where he basically signed a peace agreement with local Jewish tribes, and then once they went out on business, he came ahead and he slaughtered them too. But this chant is what we're seeing in Sydney and in Melbourne and in London, anywhere where these pro-jihad / pro-Palestine protests. They are announcing, remember Jews, we're going to come back and we're going to slaughter you, men, women, and children, just like we did in Khaybar 1,400 years ago. And this is the quote unquote innocent civilians of Gaza, right? This isn't Hamas terrorists. So like we said, unless the indoctrination changes, that is not going to end. I like how he said, we're not going to give up our weapons unless it's to the Palestinian Authority and we become part of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority anyways works every single day to annihilate Israel, just in more diplomatic means, even though there are a lot of officials in the Palestinian Authority that have done terrorist attacks and killed Jews, stabbed Jews, etc. Basically, they're saying, we're not actually going to end this. We're going to continue the fight. And you think we're going to give up our weapons, but we won't. And that is something that I am worried about, is that maybe there will be this grand show. And if the international pressure is strong enough, right, there may be this grand show and they 5,000 people come and say, Hamas members come and say, hey, we give up our arms. Here's our weapons. Send us to Tunisia. Behind the scenes, like you said, they're going to rebrand it as the Gaza Security Forces. They're going to maintain their power. They're still going to be the big dog in Gaza. They're still going to be the kind of the gangsters in charge. They're still going to take taxes and blackmail the local population and then use that money to build weapons and tunnels and attack infrastructure to try and kill more Jews. Earlier, we mentioned that for every Israeli that released, Israel has to release prisoners. It's the ratio something like 15-1, at least for the dead bodies is 15-1. But it's also worth mentioning that most of these hostages were people who were dancing in a music festival for the sake of peace. That was the idea and the name of the music festival, the Nova Music Festival. It's called the Peace Festival.
And to be clear, you're referring to the individuals that were captured, that were taken hostage from Israel and dragged across into Gaza. Whereas the people that were arrested and are being held by the Israelis were people that were actually doing things which were intentionally harmful. So those people they were generally either at a kibbutz or they were dancing at the music festival. They're minding their own business. These were not combatants. These were just civilians having, many of them again, at a peaceful celebration, and out of nowhere, they got their either lives ended or their lives were changed forever in a horrific way.
Exactly. And whereas the people that Israel, these prisoners that Israel are releasing, a lot of these are like real terrorists. One of them, for example, is the terrorist that killed the Fogel family. I remember when this happened, a family was sleeping in their home and two terrorists were able to break in to this community in Judea and Samaria. They got through the fence. They were able to find the home. They went in, stabbed, or they shot the father. And then they went through the bedrooms and they just beheaded the children. They stabbed them. They murdered them. Young babies, including like a 3-month-old baby. There were 5 kids in the home, I think, of the Fogel family. And they just massacred these children. Young babies who have never done anything. I remember when it happened and I couldn't stop crying. So these are the people being released. Remember, this entire October 7th happened by the kind of leadership of Sinwar. And Sinwar was in his Israeli prison. He actually had brain cancer, and his life was saved by Israeli doctors, by Jewish doctors. And he was released from prison because his brother and other Hamas terrorists kidnapped an Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit. And in return for Gilad Shalit, Israel agreed to release 1,200 terrorists, right? So we already have been here before, where we release terrorists in order to get a hostage back. And in return, the terrorist becomes the mastermind of the next terror attack. So that is something that Israel is very worried about, rightfully. And I think that's something we really have to keep our eye out. And again, if they have a nice show of giving up their weapons, it doesn't mean they're actually giving up their weapons. What we really need is Israel to continue the effective dismantling of Hamas until there really is nothing left. And then maybe we can have Indonesian traffic police.
Yeah, maybe that, again, would help some individuals who are struggling to understand this, the reluctance. And in one of the news stories that we posted earlier on, it was showing the dichotomy, how there was this, and certainly Netanyahu had a strong interest in essentially annihilating the people that did this to his people. And people were saying, just end the war, it's okay, just whatever it takes to release the hostages. And there was these two opposing things. This is a middle ground, because these people, there are people who are horrific, murderous, terroristic criminals that are being released back out, only to perhaps do something again another day. But it's being done because of the value of getting back the people that were being held hostage. And as you said, Hamas knows and plays the same game over and over again, because to a certain extent it works. The hope is that this peace deal is going to change the dynamics in the entire region there. That's the only hope, that it changes it for long enough that it can actually sustain some permanent change. And as we just alluded to, the most recent news stories are rather alarming, but not, to me, surprising. We have actual executions happening in the streets in Gaza. I put up the last clip that we have relating to these stories now. It's basically just talks a little bit about that. It's the power struggle, the internal sort of different groups who are trying to show their strength despite the peace that's in place with Israel. They got their own beef that they're going to settle now. Let's take a look at this story.
Hamas fighters conducting a public execution of alleged Israeli collaborators. The footage here shows Hamas gunmen lining up 7 men in a public square and shooting them from behind. Hamas confirmed the authenticity of the video. The group told Reuters they will not be tolerating any violations of order in Gaza. Palestinian security sources say dozens of people have been killed in clashes between Hamas fighters and rival tribal groups in recent days.
It depends on what level you want to go down to, but you've got Hamas and allied groups who are, if you like, of an Islamist stamp. You've also got non-Islamist hardline Palestinians who reject any accommodation with Israel. And then you've got some groups who are not allied with Hamas. And then you've got clans and families. In many cases, those people are against Hamas as well.
And that's where we're at. And that's what's happening on the ground there now, with more and more people coming back to their demolished home sites. Who knows what's going to happen to them too, with their fellow Gazans and the Hamas powers that are still there, deciding who they want to keep and who they want to get rid of before it gets too late for them to do that. So I expect some more of this, unless the IDF or there's some other forces that step in and try to discourage it. I'm pretty sure that behind the scenes there's quite a bit of pressure and phone calls being made saying, look, we have peace. We can't have the people there just going and doing this to each other in public, in front of everyone, just going and picking who they want to murder. But that's where we're at. And I think this will obviously be an evolving story that we'll cover during our regular podcast episodes as it unfolds, and with our fingers crossed and prayers in our heart for continued peace and to get the remaining hostages, the deceased, all back, and that the people that are there have an opportunity on both sides to not have to deal with this anymore.
Exactly. It's worth noting that these public executions are deliberately done in public, and the crowds go wild with excitement. Like, in our Western mind, we cannot understand how seeing somebody possibly, maybe likely innocent, the crime would be trying to work with Israel to end Hamas's dictatorship. A lot of these, so there was like a clan called the Wabsha clan. They rejected working with Israel. They weren't even working with Israel. They were just another clan that was pretty powerful. Hamas came and tried to kill them. They massacred 48. They raped the women. They burnt their houses. They really massacred them. They killed 12 of Hamas. Mr. F. Fafo, who anybody who was tracking this, was killed in this exchange. For some reason, there have been notable people around the world who have been decrying this as some crime of Israel, even though it was Palestinians who killed them. But these public executions are a way for Hamas to regain control. And again, that's something that we just cannot accept. And originally, Trump was saying, yeah, Hamas needed to get rid of very bad criminal organizations that are there, and I let them do it. And then Trump started to walk it back and say, hey, I don't like it that there's this fighting zone. Maybe we'll create safe zones and allow Palestinian civilians into the safe zones that I guess Israel will control. It's worth noting that Trump said that no Americans will be in Gaza. There are about 200 soldiers, but they won't be entering Gaza. But during these public executions, the crowds are going wild. And the crowds of Gazans are chanting, from here on to Al-Quds to Jerusalem, we're going to conquer all of Israel. We're going to kill the Jews. So basically, the vast majority of people in Gaza have not been reformed. That's really what's important to remember. And unless, like you mentioned, somebody stops this violence, the violence will continue. Unfortunately, that's the Middle East. If you look in Iraq, if you look in Syria, if you look anywhere in the Middle East, everybody's like, oh, Israel is such a horrible place. There really should be a Palestine. It's like, okay, what would have Palestine been if there wasn't Israel? It would have been another shithole of people just killing each other and men conducting female genital mutilation on young children. You know what I mean? It would probably be a really, really horrible place. Thankfully, that's not what Israel is. And what we have to do is make sure that Gaza doesn't become that. We have to make sure that these factions and Hamas, all these violent actors are replaced and that safety and stability occurs. I think all these Arab states have donated billions of dollars to build Gaza. They saw all of their investment go down into trash. I think they hopefully will be more reluctant to reinvest unless they're certain that Hamas is not going to come back again, because now they know that if Hamas comes back again, their money will go to waste again. So hopefully these Arab donor countries have learned their lesson. It is starting to seem like that. And they are demanding, we will not work with Hamas. And hopefully they're smart enough to recognize that if when Hamas changes their uniform, it's still Hamas. Or if there's a new faction that acts and thinks exactly the way Hamas does, it's still Hamas, right? So that's really what we need. And what we really need, like we mentioned, is re-education in 20 years. But like you said, Israel's greatest dream and the greatest dream of every decent person around the world is that Gaza is reformed and the people there can have a good quality of life and there could be peaceful relationships, and that the Abraham Accords extend to Lebanon and to Syria and to Indonesia and all over the Muslim and Arab countries all over the world. And hopefully one day Gaza is peace and developed. It's such an amazing piece of real estate. Like I said, many years ago, for a very short time, before the Jews were expelled, I went there just to see what it was before it was destroyed. And it's one of the most marvelous, beautiful beaches in the world. There's so much potential. Now there's natural gas in the oceans off of Gaza. There is so much potential there. It really could be a gem, but only if the people change their mindset and their ideology. The problem isn't necessarily the people. The problem is the ideology that the people hold. The ideology, unfortunately, is very much influenced by religion. We need that ideology to be reformed, to be changed, so people have an ideology of building, not destroying. Unfortunately, the world is divided between people who want to build and people who want to destroy. You mentioned Ben Shapiro recently has a new book, Lions and Scavengers. That's basically the same idea. What we want our neighbors to be are lions, people who build, people who want to invest in their future, not people who want to destroy their neighbor's future. And fingers crossed, that's what this new Trump initiative will accomplish. It seems unbelievable, but if anybody can do the unbelievable, it's Trump.
Well, the unbelievable so far has already happened. So the living hostages are home. Gotten back some of the deceased hostages. And there is an unheard of cooperation between Arab states, Israel, United States, and beyond. And we had all, like you said, all these world leaders at this 2025 Peace Summit. Ultimately, at least the door is open. And not that long ago, months ago, weeks ago perhaps, most people would have not believed we would be where we are today. So it's with hope and certainly with optimism. I think with a lot of hard work, prayer certainly can't hurt. There's a chance. And although on our In Focus segments, we don't typically end with anything funny or what have you, there is something that we did put together, which you haven't seen yet, that I think is just an appropriate sort of, ending to what is a difficult topic. that we covered today. Let's take a look at that, and I think you'll enjoy it. The Instagram channel, which I'll mention the name in a minute after this airs, the individual you're going to see is described as a fashion model, and it says proud Israeli. So without further ado, these were posted sequentially as things unfolded. So the first pieces are before there was a peace deal. Once the peace deal was in place, once the hostages were being released, once they were released, now as we're waiting for the remaining hostages who are deceased to be all released. Let's take a look.
There's a picture of us in a layer of dust on the mantle, right by my cigarettes that I smoked since you left, 'cause you said you had to fly in your October sky. La, la, la. מים רבים לא יכבו את האהבה ונהרות לא ישטפו. New day will rise. Everyone cries, don't cry.
פגשתי אותו בלב המדבר, יפה שקיעת שמש ללב עצוב, ציירתי לו עץ וכבשה על נייר, והוא הבטיח לי שישוב. הנסיך הקטן מפלוגה ב' לא יראה עוד כבשה שאוכלת פרח, בכל שושנה בין קוצים שעט, וליבו הקטן קפא
They say supermodels are dumb, but this is a supermodel who's brilliant.
Very brilliant. This is Cooper_Aussie, like Australian, _dog. Cooper Aussie dog is their Instagram handle, and is an Australian Shepherd, which are very smart dogs. The cat, I think, was Jinx, as a cat looks same color pattern. And they've been posting these on and on. I've been collecting them. This is like amazing. And I'm always waiting to see what the next one is. And I couldn't help but put them all together because it's a fitting tribute, I think, better than pictures worth 1,000 words, but I think these videos are worth even more. Very touching. And the message basically at the end, the 24, to bring all the remaining deceased hostages home as well. And if you go back and watch the video, you can read through all the different messages of encouragement that are being put out there. And I think it's everyone's message is important, including an Australian Shepherd that has a lot to say. And it's sad that a dog may speak volumes when some of the people that should be speaking out now are silent. They should all be celebrating and they should be encouraging. There should be no opposition. There should be no effort to discourage the success that has been had so far, and no effort to not recognize it. And it's sad to see, but perhaps not surprising, because that's the nature of politics. It's the nature of humanity. There's always some people that are looking for the negative, that don't want the good. And it just shows that for the last 2 years, many of the people out there, again, protesting and what have you, their words were completely meaningless because the one thing they were saying they wanted. Here it is. Here it is.
What a beautiful message. It's also worth bowing our hat for all of the dogs that were massacred on October 7th. The villages and towns had lots and lots of dogs, and the terrorists hate dogs. It's a curse word in Arabic, calling somebody kalb, and they massacred lots of dogs on October 7th. And lots of the heroic dogs that fought in the IDF, sniffing out bombs and helping soldiers not die from IEDs. And occasionally they died as well. So there are a lot of heroic dogs who have done phenomenal actions and who were massacred for no reason. And this dog is a beautiful way to remember them as well. So yeah,
Absolutely.
hopefully for brighter futures, new days will rise.
An opportunity. That's where we're at. An opportunity for great change in the entire region, perhaps for peace to spread. We're hopeful for Ukraine. We're hopeful that, and there's been an announcement that Trump will be meeting with Putin in the next week or so. Perhaps peace will be contagious. Perhaps it'll spread. Perhaps we'll have an era and a time of peace throughout the world, something we can all hope for. And with that, we just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for helping work through all the ins and outs and the nuances of the peace deal, the hostage release, and where things are at. And I want to thank you. Yo, you have firsthand knowledge, and you're able to speak with authority based on what you've seen, family that you have that's lived in Israel for a long time as well. So it's very important, and we're hopeful, and we're encouraged, and time will tell.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you for putting this together and for your brilliant words of wisdom. Yeah, it's awesome having a friend like you, and it's time like these that we should appreciate our loved ones and our friends and our family, because that's what's really important in life.
I think it is.
Thank
you. Ditto. It's and for those who didn't watch our very first episode months ago, we talked about putting a podcast together for a long time. We're glad to be doing this. It seems to be very well received, and we're doing better than perhaps many people would have thought we would, given that it's hard to launch a new podcast. It's hard to put all these things together. It is work, but we think it's important.
Tremendous amount of work that you mostly do, and we're hugely thankful for the amount of time and dedication and effort and money that you put into this podcast and to everything else that you do. You're a person who cares.
It is the YoJoeShow Podcast. I couldn't do it without you. And you're the one that really twisted my arm for us to get this going. So otherwise we probably wouldn't be here. But just an appreciation. And again, I think it's a reminder to everybody. Don't go it alone. Your friends, your family, the people that can be there by your side to have your back are very important in this time and in all times. So again, we thank you for joining us. With that said,
thank you for watching, and we would love your comments. Please be detailed and share your feelings, your thoughts, your arguments, anything you have in the comments below. And looking forward to the next episode of the YoJoeShow Podcast. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Joe.
Thank you, Yo. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Have a great night.
We hope you found our In Focus segment informative. For more content, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.